Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Thank you for joining me in this live stream entitled Toward the Phenomenology and Metaphysics of Matter and Spirit. So, we continue to think along with Edith Stein in her philosophy of being and phenomenology of givenness combined, as well as her theological anthropology, above all, which is at the heart of her work. So I'm taking commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein, spending some time in chapter 2 of this book entitled Spiritual Being. Ultimately asking the question, what is spirit? What is spiritual being? How does it give itself within lived experience? What is the meaning of spirit? How do we experience it? How do we feel it? How do we think it in relation to matter, which is so much more obvious for us that there is matter. I don't think anyone is disputing that fact. Uh, so we have to tend to give a defense and apologetic of spirit. What is spiritual being? In contemporary philosophy, we still need to do this. I think in my graduate studies of philosophy and theology, so often what's happening is reductionism of things spirit to matter, a reductionism of the soul to the body. People are much more comfortable in a post-rationalist world to do this kind of maneuver, reducing all things to matter and motion, mass, energy, because nobody's contesting that. It's so obvious that there is matter, that there are bodies, but what else? And getting back to classical metaphysics with the question, if there are bodies, what is the necessary condition of possibility for there being bodies, for there being atoms? Thank you for your question, Abe. Do I know the name of the male saint that died in Italy from the early 1900s of tuberculosis, young age? I thought you were going to say the female saint, and I was going to say Saint Therese of Lisieux. Um, and I believe Saint Faustina Kowalska also died of tuberculosis. But a male, I'm not sure. That's a good thing to try to Google. Maybe you've tried that. But offhand, I can't say. But I'm more familiar with some female saints who died of tuberculosis around the year 1900, before after. So we can keep thinking about that. If anybody else catches up in the chat, maybe they'll have an idea. Okay, good. So together we try to find the answers. So yeah, taking commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being. What is spirit? What is spirit in relation to matter? So this is very exciting. So far in recent live streams, I've only set up or set the stage for asking the question, what exactly is spirit? What exactly is spiritual being? I had to set the stage by making the claim that we need a specific kind of logic to access spirit, to access spiritual being that is different than the logic of matter. That in some way is going to involve an inversion of logic and how we tend to think matter, how we tend to think being in terms of matter alone. If we think being in terms of matter alone and we're asking the question, is there something besides matter that is real? In some way, we have to perform a kind of reduction on the reductionism of materialism. And this is where phenomenology is so helpful to bracket the brackets we put on reality in terms of material hermeneutics. And we reduce everything to this interpretation of matter alone, even in terms of our working hierarchy of values. Is it not so often based on what matters for matter? What matters for matter in terms of trying to accumulate the greatest purchase power, trying to attain for oneself the heights of potentiality in terms of money, for example, money in relation to matter. So, as a teaching tool, I always like to get out some money, some American bills. I don't have big bills here, but I've got some George Washingtons. I don't have any Ben Franklins. I don't have any blue faces, but I've got a few ones. And when I put this up in the screen, isn't there something in you that says, I want that? I want more of that. Oh, you are special to have in your hand some dollars. And we have this saying in English, money makes the world go round. Because everybody seems to be in agreement, money is important. And so many of our struggles in life, what puts us in a bad mood is we lack it. We want more of it and we don't have it. And we struggle according to the Conatus Estendi. How do I get more money in my account? So I have more purchase power. So I have access to greater potentiality. But again, money is so paradoxical because it's so flimsy and weak. And the greatest representations in the concrete are just paper thin. They're just paper thin. And they weigh hardly anything. And you can put it to a flame and it's gone. And it's so unsubstantial, this money. It's so unsubstantial. And yet we covet it so much. We want it so much. Even St. Paul says that the desire for money is the root of all evil. And here's how this makes sense metaphysically. If I were to ask you, is money act or potency? Is it actual being or potential being? Primarily, what we mean by money, how we use money. And if you're answering, it's more potential, because money and the meaning of money is the potential to make a transaction and acquire other material goods or services, to acquire goods for oneself through the medium of money. So it's money itself. If you have millions of dollar bills, millions of $100 bills sitting in your house, it doesn't do much for you. The power in the money is in the potentiality for it to be a medium to access other goods, going places, buying things, procuring important services, even for basic needs. So money, St. Paul says, not that money is the root of all evil, but the desire for money is the root of all evil. When one places one's desires on the idolatry of potentiality, this is a metaphysical mistake, because where we ought to place the desires of the immaterial soul is on immaterial being we call spirit. And the maximum spiritual being we call absolute being, being itself, divinity. This makes sense metaphysically, to worship absolute being rather than absolute potential being. But instead, metaphysics points us to absolute actual being, pure act. And this is God, this is divinity. Money, this is why it's such an attractive item, because it is, we could say, such a perfect alternative to divinity. Money itself makes the greatest mockery of rational personal beings like us. To worship money, to live for money, is to live for one of the most empty idols there is. Something so lacking in substance, something so flimsy, so ephemeral. And so money, metaphysics points out the reality of money, its potentiality. in its power, its lure is in its potentiality. But instead, what we're after with Edith Stein, thinking along with her about finite and eternal being, about human and divine being, we're asking, what is spiritual being? Money is not that. Money is not spiritual being. There is some kind of form. There's a form to the bill. There's a form to the imagery on the bill. But also, money is not animated. It is we animated beings that animate it, that produce it for our purposes. And they can be good. We can use money in responsible ways. And when we read the Phenomenology of Emmanuel Levinas, we have a lot of positive things to think about with money at the service of the good of the other and being responsible for other people. Um, so it has a place, but it is a tool for personal spiritual beings. Money is a part of culture, and culture is the evidence of spirit. Animals don't have culture. Animals have instinct, they do interesting things. We can personify them, but the evidence of rationality is what we call culture and everything that makes up culture. Medicine, law, everything in the universities, all fields of learning, all questions we ask questions, that we think, that we reason, that we communicate, that we have something to do with love. And this movement toward love, something like marriage, something like religion, something like sacraments, all of this are the fibers of culture. Culture is the evidence of spirit, the concrete, incarnate, yes, materially instantiated evidence of spirit. But we want to still get at what is spirit. It's very difficult to describe that which is doing the describing. It is very difficult to define that which is doing the defining. Spiritual, rational, personal being. This is who we are at our core. So we want to ask questions like, how does Edith Stein understand the relationship between matter and spirit? How does spiritual being relate to the logic of the cross, which I've already gotten into? And what is the precise relationship between created spiritual beings and uncreated spiritual beings? So Edith Stein begins her exposition of the essence of spirit by juxtaposing the non-oppositional realities of matter and spirit. So matter and spirit have something to do with one another. They're not entirely opposed, but there is overall a unity between them, even though they're very different realities. Stein understands these contrasting yet joint realities as complementary, locating the human person at the intersection of the two. So this is the unique privilege of being human. Within the universe, we're the only creature that can claim this axis of being between spirit and matter. Personal spiritual being, personal rational spiritual being, but also having bodies. So an angel is finite, personal, rational, spiritual being, but has no matter, has no body. Animals are not personal, rational, spiritual beings. They're animated. Aristotle will talk about the sentient souls of animals, as we should, but they're not rational souls. And so they don't exist at the same intersection as us human beings. But we have a unique place in the cosmos, and this unique place where we are at once personal, spirit, and matter, soul and body. So, from a Catholic perspective of theological anthropology, the soul, in Latin anima, is understood as the forma corporis. So, the soul is the form of the body. The soul is the form of the body. So, metaphysically, we need to begin to understand spirit as form, but there's different types of formal cause, some impersonal, some personal. So there are inanimate kinds of forms, like a circle, all these geometrical shapes. And this is why Plato, in his Academy of Philosophy, there was a sign that read at the top of the entrance, "Let no man ignorant of geometry enter." Because to contemplate the forms, it begins with geometry. So circle, square, vectors, triangles, angles, circumference, radius, all these things are inanimate forms. But what we mean when we're talking about the human form as spirit and matter, we're talking about a specific kind of spiritual being that is rational, that is personal, that is not just objective, but subjective. And we will talk about the objectivity of subjectivity, thinking what is spiritual being, but involves something other than objects. But it involves the observer of object, the manipulator of object, the manufacturer of object, the connoisseur of object, the one who turns and faces this world of objects is what we mean by personal, rational, spiritual being in relation to matter. But our being, the individual human being, is the intersection of these two, spirit and matter. We are not, as Edith Stein says, we are neither angel nor animal, because in a way we involve both within our being. And so we want to get, though, especially at the relationship between spirit and matter, but we need to say a lot about what spirit is distinct from matter, because we tend not to describe it very much or define it very much. So we want to take time to do that. In Stein's theological anthropology, the human person is the only creature that incorporates both material and spiritual realms, thereby warranting the names spiritual subject and person in Stein's vocabulary. For example, in her book Potency and Act, Stein writes that finite spirits are not from themselves. That is, they do not come into existence through their own power, but they are by themselves. In German, für sich. They are for themselves, by themselves. That is, by entering into existence, they are on their own. There's a kind of definitely rational autonomy as a human being continues to grow and develop, that develops with the human being. Their individuality. Hypostasis is the specific term for this self-constancy from the Greek term, hypostasis, that sense of standing beneath the matter, forming it in a certain personal way. This self-constancy, in German, Selbstständigkeit. We shall even go ahead and restrict the word to this purely formal sense that does not include spiritualness. And we shall call what is self-sufficient insofar as it is something spiritual, a person. We would therefore have to identify spiritual subject and person, synonymous. The person is what is spiritual originally. Spiritual being requires a spiritual substance. Being a spiritual substance pertains to the person. So we see how Stein is operating with the language of person, spiritual subject, spiritual substance. We see the interplay of phenomenology and metaphysics here in these different kinds of language. Subjectivity is much more a term of phenomenology, thinking of subjectivity as consciousness, as the Lebenswelt, of the conscious intuiting subject, perceiving subject in the world, Heidegger's Dasein, for example, but also Stein is insisting on spiritual substance, substantia, and hypostasis in Greek can be translated either substance or being, or also person. This is why it was a key term for the councils of the early church in defining the doctrines of Christology, because it includes in itself both ousia and prosopon. Hypostasis in Greek includes both substance and person in its term. So to say we exist at this intersection of spirit and matter, spiritual subjectivity and material body, is to say we have a term here in coming from Greek, which helps us to understand better this intersection. And the term is hypostasis. Hypostasis, which we would translate here person. But included in the meaning is both substance and what we mean by person, a spiritual subject. So we have spiritual substance and material substance. Our substance is twofold. Our substance is united in this hypostatic union of spirit, rational spirit, and matter, which is unique for us human beings. Again, neither animal nor angel, strictly speaking, but related to both, for sure. So, spiritual substance pertains to the person. Further, Stein assumes the necessary task of metaphysically dissecting the human person in order to draw the distinction between matter and spirit. This is not merely what we would call a psychosomatic distinction from the Greek words psyche, soul, and soma, body. So it's not just psychosomatic in terms of like behavioral science, natural science, with psyche on one side and the body on the other, but it remains necessary to qualify material and spiritual reality per se, respectively, on the basis of the logic that attends the created order. That's what the philosopher is after. What is the logic that attends the order of creation? What is the logic that undergirds everything going on in the cosmos? These life cycles, as we call them. What is the logic of the circle of life, of living and dying and living and dying, but a perpetuation of life, a perpetuation of ordered being, of beautiful being, of diversified being? Why does the universe seem to defy its natural end, namely thermal equilibrium? Undifferentiated being, frozen being. Why do the stars testify against death, even though they too die? Why do new stars come and keep shining? Why do new forms of life keep evolving? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is this something exhibiting itself as living, even though it dies? What is the meaning of life and death according to the logic that attends this order of creation that we call cosmos and not chaos? Chaos happens, it threatens the cosmos, but it seems not to overcome it. Even within the very worst experiences of chaos in the human experience, when we bring about chaos for ourselves, for each other, through war, through selfishness, through greed, through a vicious conatus ascendi that is manifest in the collective unconscious and various totalitarian programs of domination and exclusion. And yet life goes on. And yet love goes on through the possibilities of forgiveness, of peacemaking, of reconciliation. But this stuff, peacemaking, forgiveness, and reconciliation, cannot be bought and sold like an object, like a commodity. These things, these acts, these meaningful acts, intentional acts, rational acts, virtuous acts testify to something other than money, matter, kinetic and potential energy. Something else that seems to contradict the exigencies of nature, that seems to contradict the demands of the conatus ascendi, the struggle to be, to persevere in one's own being. These other things, love, forgiveness, reconciliation, sacrifice, martyrdom, a kind of testimony that subverts even the most cherished values of nature, but gives evidence of what we call supernature, the supernatural, the spiritual. So we have evidence all around us for spiritual being, but we want to let the evidence guide us to a clarification, both descriptive and explanatory, both phenomenological and metaphysical, as to what spirit gives and what spirit is. It is through the methods of phenomenology and metaphysics that Edith Stein provides a sketch of a holistic theological anthropology that reveals the totality of the human person as such. By exerting the phenomenological epoche or reduction on human personhood, and again, we have to understand what this is for phenomenology. It sounds like we're reducing something to less than it is. But the paradox about the phenomenological reduction is it's a reducing of reductionism. We intentionally reduce reductionism to expand what gives itself to spiritual subjectivity. So to exert the phenomenological reduction on human personhood means to open it to its maximum givenness and signification within phenomenology. But what we're reducing is not the human being, not the human person, but we're reducing our reductionistic interpretations of human personhood in order to let the mystery of the person saturate our hermeneutic intentionality through its giving intuition, its signifying ethical imperatives. So, through the phenomenological reduction, Edith Stein is able to disclose the intersection at which we live and move and have our being, to use the words of St. Paul in Acts of the Apostles. The intersection of the personal spiritual and the corporeal material. The provocativeness of Stein's project is in her boldness of working to determine the respective quiddities or whatness of matter and spirit. So let's first of all think about matter, which is much more familiar to thought. Stein defines matter as that which fills space, is time-bound, and is ontologically in potentia. In potentia. So metaphysically speaking, what we mean by matter is more akin to potency than to act. Why is this the case? Matter is potency, more so than act or actuality. So we have act and potency, categories I've talked about before on previous live streams. But matter we associate with potency. Why is that? Even if we take something like the helium atom with 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons running around the nucleus of the atom, these subatomic particles have the potential to participate in any number of forms in the order of being. Everything on the periodic table of elements, every element involves the subatomic particles. What are those in the massive nucleus and also those in the electron orbitals around the nucleus of the atom. And so the electron is subject to what's around it. If there's another kind of atom or molecule that's pulling it toward it more strongly, it'll go there. What we have with atoms is a constant fluctuation of form, but nevertheless, in chemistry, we identify at least stable forms for a time that we call this atom or that atom. But it's very theoretical, because the reality of matter is that it's in constant flux. Every biological organism, every atom, every subatomic particle, things are morphing one into the other. So we don't have immutable proton or an immutable neutron or an immutable electron or an immutable atom. Even though the atom is the smallest unit that defines a differentiated element, one from another, on the periodic table, the elements themselves are radically subject to change. And every atom has undergone change millions of times. There's no immutable particle in the universe. You can study on the macro level or the micro level. All of these particles are morphing one into the other all the time. And if that's the case, we can't identify one particle that is responsibility for the constancy of any individual being in the universe, let alone living ones whose cells are constantly growing, reproducing, dying through mitosis and taking the place of each other. So matter is defined by change. It's defined by becoming. And it's ultimately, therefore, defined as potency. This, and a similar thing with money, as I brought this up before with money is more a matter of potency than act, because money doesn't say I'm going to spend myself on this or that. It is the spiritual subject who makes the money and chooses what to do with the money, and I'm going to get this or that. This dollar bill could go toward buying anything in the world. And so it's radically potential. It's not actual. It's not deciding what it's doing with itself. It's not in motion at all, unless I send it in motion. Me, who has much more act than the potency of this very thin, flimsy paper dollar bill. And so the things like money, like matter, are a function of potency that don't determine themselves, but they are radically contingent, dependent, and subject to the forces at work on them. Namely, what forces at work giving shape to matter, causing it to participate in this particular individual form of being or that particular individual form of being. Act, form, cause. And when it comes to ourselves, clearly, spirit, deliberation, will, decision, judgment, all of these things that are not a function of atoms and subatomic particles and molecules, that in no way have any volition. But we are the ones who have volition, who have freedom, will, intellectuality, rationality. We are the ones who cause matter to do a whole bunch of things on this planet Earth and beyond. We are the ones. So who are we? What are we that has such dominion in relation to matter? What gives us such dominion in relation to matter? We are not very big, relatively speaking, in the universe. We are very small. And the fact that we have bodies made of matter that's constantly changing is to say we're very feeble, frail, susceptible, vulnerable beings. And yet we exercise such power in relation to matter because there's something about us that is immaterial in relation to the matter, how we turn and face it, how we measure and manipulate it, how we theorize about it. Case in point, what is this otherness in relation to matter, in which we are, in a sense, co-creators, poets with divinity, making things, making inventions, theorizing about it, getting to the truth about matter in relation to spirit. There's something else going on. Its evidence is everywhere, often glossed over because we're so fixated in our spirit on the matter, on the money. Who has time to ask questions about what is matter, what is spirit, when so much money has to be made? So, those of us who are in the fields of philosophy and theology tend not to be rich unless we inherited some money. But we don't go into these fields to make a lot of it. The fields that tend to make a lot of money are things like business and healthcare, and those sciences that deal with business and healthcare, and building, construction, working with matter. Like attracts like. And the stuff we do in philosophy and theology takes into account matter, takes into account money, but is after a much higher prize. We might call happiness. And we know from sound philosophy and theology that you can't buy happiness, you can't buy love. But these things that we're concerned about, of ultimate concern, again, the questions we ask that lead us there attest to something other than money and matter and potency. What we're after in philosophy and theology, above all, is act, and is pure act. What we also call divinity, what we also call God. We want this. We want this fullness of being, of act. And we ourselves, as philosophers and theologians, testify to the otherwise than matter by giving it up, by sharing it, by recognizing, this too is a good, but it's meant to circulate and not be hoarded. And so we find ways to think about how to live virtuously rather than viciously. We ask ethical questions, and that we ask ethical questions also is evidence that we are not purely determined organisms that can do no other than consume food and drink and copulate and move to acquire these goods for ourselves. But Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary, his mother, all the saints, angels themselves and their being without physical bodies, all of these things attest to an otherwise than matter, and that for the sake of which matter exists. In fact, Jesus teaches us philosophically, metaphysically, phenomenologically, the purpose of matter, to give it away. Jesus teaches no person has greater love than to lay down his or her life for his or her friends. There's no greater love. There's no greater human act with money than to share it with the other who is lacking it. Money has a purpose. And just like love, money is meant to circulate. And what a person acts wisely with money when they understand it to be a gift that is received to the measure that it is given away in turn, that it is circulated, that it is put in motion for the good of the other, not to simply stockpile it for oneself, but to share it. And our human nature demands that we do so freely, not in a coerced way, but to recognize the vocation to share one's goods, to share one's body in service of the other. And Jesus shows us the maximum actualization of human flesh in his voluntary suffering and death, so that God could suffer and die with us in order for us to rise with him, to redeem us. So the gospel of Jesus Christ is a revelation of spirit in relation to matter, in no way saying that matter is bad, like the early Gnostic heresies and Manichaeism and things that regarded spirit good, matter bad. No, for Catholic Christian philosophy and theology, we regard matter as incredibly good, created by God as good. We read in Genesis chapter 1, God looks at everything God makes after God makes it and finds it tov in Hebrew. And after the human beings are made, tov mechod, very good. There's a goodness of God's creation in every way. If we resist letting it be distorted. So Edith Stein defines matter as what fills space, is time-bound, and is ontologically in potency. However, from the outset, Stein is careful not to position matter as exclusively material, since, quote, the material thing is not purely material and should properly be understood in its makeup, first from the viewpoint of spirit, end quote. So she says, we have no instance in the universe of unformed matter. Every piece of matter, every speck, every subatomic particle is already in some way formed matter. It has been caused into existence by spiritual being, giving rise from nothing to material being that is always formed being. In metaphysics, we have a purely theoretical concept of materia prima, or prime matter. That doesn't exist in hylomorphic reality. Prime matter means pure potency in relation to pure act. Divinity is defined by metaphysics as pure act. So what is pure potency? Is it evil in relation to good? In a certain metaphysical sense, yes. But when we hear the word evil, we tend to think of a moral evil. So I'm not talking about a moral evil here, but I'm talking about a metaphysical evil, or the maximum deprivation of substance, deprivation of act, or otherwise than act, is potency. So potency is what we might call metaphysically evil. That is lacking the goodness of being because it doesn't have existence without actuality, giving form to prime matter, making it some individual being of this or that, whether at the micro level or macro level. So I hope you can follow what I'm trying to get at here. We have these juxtaposed opposites in metaphysics: pure act in relation to pure potency. And in the realm of becoming, there are various gradations of being between these. And the approach of null being is what we observe in natural science with what's called entropy, and this cosmic disintegration toward a chaotic, frozen thermal equilibrium. So this, we would say, is a great deprivation of cosmos, of ordered individual beings, of living and non-living beings that are so incredibly diversified, and yet there's this symbiotic relationship between everything in the universe, especially for living organisms. So Maximum actuality is divinity. Maximum potentiality is an empty concept, more empty than nothing. It's a pure theoretical concept that requires act to actualize potency, that we might have actual being in a hylomorphic sense. So Stein is saying every speck of matter has something to do with spirit, has something to do with a formal causality as well as final causality that brings that speck of matter into being in relation to the other ones. The material thing in reality is composed at once of matter and form. The formal spiritual component being that which gives shape to theoretical prime matter. So God creates a universe from nothing by welcoming the radically other to divine being, metaphysically speaking, into being. So I said earlier, prime matter as a purely theoretical concept could be interpreted as what we might mean by metaphysically evil in relation to metaphysical good and the fullness of metaphysical goodness that is absolute being, pure act, divinity. But what I mean here also is that there's nothing closer to nothing than prime matter. But God welcomes prime matter into existence, which then implies temporality, in order for there to exist something other than God. So the purpose of potentiality is creation. So potentiality actually is good, in as much as it's been actualized as such. It's been actualized as potentiality. But to be actualized as potentiality means we have the potential of the potentiality to be further actualized in the case of all these various actual individual forms of being, big and small. So God welcomes the metaphysically other into being, that is pure potency, in the act of creation by making something from nothing, welcoming the otherwise than divinity into being. So the testimony of matter is the other in relation to divinity. But within Christianity, we have something wonderful that happens between divinity and creation. And that wonderful occurrence, that wonderful event, we call the incarnation of God, where the divine nature becomes united with the creaturely nature. And the nature God chooses to do this through is the human nature that has the privilege of existing as the axis mundi of personal, rational, spiritual being and material being. So what God does in the incarnation is an incredible act of divine hospitality in relation to matter. What's meant by the incarnation is to say that matter isn't going anywhere. That matter itself is related to eternity because God makes it so. God wills it to be the case. And God certifies, confirms, and seals the eternal destiny of matter to participate in divine being and divine life into eternity by taking a body to himself through the incarnation, not just a finite body, but also finite spirit, a human soul. That Jesus is true God and true man. This is the logic of Christianity. And it makes perfect sense metaphysically what God is up to here with creation and redemption. That God becomes human so that the entire cosmos would be saved from a chaos back into nothingness. So we have these laws of thermodynamics, and one of them we know very well. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Yes, well, we have these observations of physics because of the parameters we're putting on the hermeneutics, the interpretation. Yes, we say that. In light of Einstein's mass energy equivalence equation, E equals mc squared, we can say the same thing for matter. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Because it's convertible into energy, energy is convertible into mass, one into the other. This flux we call the universe, the physical universe. But again, what is granting stable, diversified, individual being to all these uh, countless beings in the universe? Spirit, formal and final causality, above all, divinity, divine providence, the divine will. But we're getting at metaphysically the distinction between matter and form, matter and spirit. Matter is extended in space according to its peculiar form, as bearing within itself the utmost potentiality. Matter is malleable in its nature and submits to external force from without by adapting to new configurations and structures. Matter has no choice about the matter. About the matter it is. Matter is pure susceptibility, pure conformability to whatever is in the local environment. And for example, the stars, the radiant and thermal energy coming from the core of the stars, like the sun, will have its way with any particles of matter in its path. We could say, safe to say, the stars are the most powerful energy centers about the universe, and there's billions and billions of them. Um, isn't it crazy? Isn't it remarkable? We live on this little planet Earth in this vast universe, and here we are doing all of our dealings. This little speck in the universe, the little speck of our individual being, the specks that we're made up of. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Genesis chapter 3, Ash Wednesday, Roman Catholic liturgy. So this is the reality about our being, our embodied being. But at the same time, isn't it all so marvelous? We have life. We have individual being. We have the capacity to reason about it all and to care for each other, even when we undergo infirmity, accidents, disability, that our humanity is evinced all the more through these acts of love and solidarity with the other person who faces me. So we have evidence of spirit, of our spiritual souls, but we're still dealing with matter, the body. Matter is extended in space according to its peculiar form. It's malleable, it's susceptible to whatever is around it. While operating on the level of macro physics, Edith Stein adheres to the insights of evolutionary theory, like biological evolution, while at the same time refusing to jettison the possibilities of that which would remain incalculable by the most innovative advances in microphysics, namely the possibilities of spiritual reality. From a phenomenological perspective, we always have to keep every possibility open in terms of meaning, in terms of givenness. So phenomenology would want to ask what gives itself in terms that we, long after the fact of givenness, call spiritual being. What gives as spirit? Phenomenology can investigate this a great deal in terms of ethics, like in the work of Levinas, in terms of hermeneutics and work like Paul Ricoeur, in terms of the gift and givenness in the work of Jean-Luc Marion, in terms of subjectivity, Dasein in Heidegger, in terms of intentionality, consciousness, dealing with immanent data and spiritual consciousness, like as in Husserl. Phenomenology can investigate spirit a whole lot and has done so to a high degree already, but most people don't study phenomenology, so they wouldn't know that spirit gives, because they don't take time to let it. Because we are so preoccupied with making that money to get those material goods, and yes, we of course all have to deal with them, but what else gives within lived experience that even is more meaningful than money, that even is more meaningful than matter? So here we go. This is my first now foray into moving toward a phenomenological description of spirit and a metaphysical definition of spirit with Edith Stein. So in contrast to matter, but not entirely incongruous in relation to it, spiritual being for Edith Stein is the antithesis, we could say, of matter, yet not for that reason opposed to it or in combat with it or competition with it. Although for Christian anthropology, we understand there to be a tension in our being as at once spirit and body. And St. Paul uses the language of pneuma for spirit and especially sarx for the material body, that these two, he says, are at war with each other. Galatians chapter 5, for example, he's talking about the works of the sarx, the flesh, versus the fruit of the pneuma, the spirit. And so there is this opposition we experience, the tinder for sin of concupiscence. And even St. Paul in his letter to the Romans says, I do not do what I want to do. Or as Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. There's something not entirely stable and balanced about the human nature. There's an opposition that the self faces at once as body and soul, and we experience this every day. So all the while I make light of money, yes, you can exercise a hermeneutic of suspicion on me and say, yeah, but you have your bank account, don't you? You have your family to care for. You have to deal with it. Yes, of course, I do. But, what we're getting at is this via media of we're not trying to condemn anything here. We're trying to unmask and call out sin and vice for the sake of virtue and the good. So this is what Edith Stein is doing. She's not a Platonist, a pure Platonist. She's not um, uh, falling into some kind of Christian Gnosticism. She's very balanced. She's very Thomistic. She's not an idealist, for sure. She would have said she's not an idealist. She would criticize her master Husserl for drifting into idealism later in his life, in his phenomenology. So she understood herself to be a realist and understand being in terms of Aristotelian hylomorphism, matter and form. So this is always a very positive interpretation of spirit in relation to matter with Edith Stein. So now I want to feature a quote from her book, again, Potency and Act, where she talks about spiritual being. And we're going to have several quotes to come in future live streams about what is spirit, what is spiritual being. But we'll begin with this one, where Edith Stein writes, the common what of spirit we may take negatively as immaterial. So one of the first definitions of spirit is not matter. Okay, but that's very important because too often when we ask the question of being, when we interpret reality, we want to force spirit to to conform to a material manifestation with all the other atoms, elements, molecules, and bodies. We want to say, for us to assent to the reality of spirit, it must be a piece of matter. But by definition, We begin by saying spirit is not matter. So we have to get at least that much clear to start. Spirit is precisely other than matter, otherwise than the periodic table of elements, otherwise than atoms. Spirit is not made of atoms. Spirit itself, in terms of the maximum meaning of spirit as absolute being, as divine spirit, is not time-bound even. It's atemporal and immaterial. It doesn't fill space like material particles fill space. It's something different. We can even think opposite. Spirit is the photographic negative of matter. And metaphysically entirely necessary condition of the potentiality of matter. The common what of spirit we may take from the start negatively as immaterial. It does not fill space, is not bound to time in the same way as a material what is bound to time, and lacks sensible qualities. We can't experience spirit per se through the five senses, through the unity of the five senses. The unity of the five senses and our coordination of interpretation of what the body perceives through the body, through the senses, involves a spiritual agent intellect, as Thomas Aquinas would call it, involves a spiritual soul to synthesize and integrate all of the sense data. The sense data don't interpret themselves, and atoms don't interpret atoms. It takes a spiritual soul to interpret matter and spirit as spirit. The one doing the interpreting. Positively, what can we say spirit is? We may understand, Stein says, the what of spirit as being illumined, being open, being active, or able to be illumined, illuminated, open, and active. So both the actuality of what, when she says illumination, it's metaphorical. And again, as embodied beings, we can't help, even when we abstract from matter to talk about matter or spirit, we can't help but refer along the way to metaphors of matter to understand spirit. There's no way we can talk about spirit directly with no reference to matter, since we have bodies, we have senses. So even if by way of analogy, we can't prescind from matter, prescind from the body, and talk about spirit as spirit through the soul. We're unable to do that. When we try to communicate about spirit, we inevitably will use material metaphors to do so. So Edith Stein is doing that here. The nature of spiritual being is to be illumined or to illuminate. But we might say literally, we're not stars. We're not the sun. We don't emit thermal and radiant energy like a star. We emit some thermal energy through metabolism, and when we move and exercise, we emit some heat, but we don't emit light per se like a star. We don't have nuclear fusion going on in us and have photons shining out from our bodies. So what does it mean to say spirit is illumined? What's being illumined? It's more a metaphor at the service of epistemology and the intellectual acts. That the intellect is illumined. We can think here of an Augustinian illuminationist epistemology, that it is the divine logos that illuminates the finite intellect and permits us to perceive a thing, know a thing, understand a thing, judge a thing, and have a voluntary response to what we are knowing, um, a voluntary response to the illumination, the intellectual illumination of knowledge. So this is what Edith Stein is getting at here, not a literal emitting light rays from our bodies, but it's a material metaphor to describe what is spirit doing. Spirit is perceiving and knowing and being formed, while at the same time forming material elements to make a body and to keep that body individuated from other ones and to subsist as a body within the course of time between the no longer and the not yet through this spiritual substance we call the soul. The Greek psyche, Hebrew nephesh, Latin anima, of the person. There is no person without the spiritual soul. There is no human being without both soul and body. So, positively, we understand spiritual being having to do with illumination in terms of intellectual activity and voluntary activity, the higher faculties of the soul, memory, meaning making, above all, loving. Stein also consistently describes spirit, rational spirit, as open and active. It is open by a constant perceiving of the world, not just in terms of sense data, not just in terms of natural material stimuli in which the body is reacting in an instinctive, deterministic way in every instance, but open in terms of open to the givenness of meaning within lived experience, open to the revelation of the truth within thought, open. Spirit is open. This is why when we fall prey to a reductionism philosophically, we become less spiritual. And we see that it's called atheism, uh, as one, materialism, secularism. We don't think about God. We don't go to church, synagogue, mosque, whatever. We go about life worshiping the almighty dollar. And this is evidence uh, of irrationalism, of idolatry, to worship that which in no way deserves our worship. It doesn't get much more ephemeral than the dollar bill. But that is the great irony and paradox of the hierarchy of values of the world. They're inimical and antithetical to those of divinity, those of divine revelation, which in Christianity are characterized by the gestalt we call the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I've had previous live streams about those. So, open and active. Spiritual being is active in terms of forming matter in general. In terms of individual biological being, it's active through nutrition, hydration, metabolism, uh, growth, development, sexual reproduction, movement, locomotion. So, all these biological organisms that do these different things, there's animation about the being, there's sentient spirits here. There is some kind of soul here. But what's unique about the human being is we don't just have sentience, we don't just have perception, we don't just have instinctual drives. We have this free will, this capacity of decision, this capacity to decide in such a way that we're informed by things, meanings, values that transcend the natural order of things and the straightforward conatus essendi that the animals live according to every instant of their temporal lives. We have rationality, we have volition, we have will, and we are the only creature able to know and love our Creator. to read what the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, the only creature made for our own sakes, because we're the only creature in the Imago Dei, in the actual image of God, by way of analogy that approximates this absolute being, this pure act, in terms of rationality, volition, personhood, love, these kinds of things. So to say spiritual being, its definition involves illumination, openness, and activity. This is what we're getting at. That I can decide that I'm going to do a live stream, that I can decide that I'm going to take this marker and I'm going to write on this dry erase board, that I can deliberate about things, that I can teach, that I can ask questions, that I can choose to do certain acts. The act itself, genuine human acts, are always evidence of spirit, even when they're misled ones, when they're bad ones, when they're immoral ones, when they're destructive ones. That someone is acting is evidence of a personal spiritual soul. That someone even is being cared for, even if, let's say, the infant, let's even say the infant in the womb, we don't say is exhibiting volition just yet, but it's in potentia, it's growing and developing. And the volition of the infant, the developing volition of the infant, depends on the actualized volition of the caretakers, the mother, the father, whoever is taking care of the young one, or the disabled person, or so on, or the infirm person, the elderly person, the person in a comatose state, and so on. So, as a human individual, we're not just human individuals, we are humanity. We are constantly related to one another. We are at once individual and community, whether we like it or not. And one person's volition is formed by another's. This is why the acts that we do, what we think, what we say, what we do, have so much impact on each other. And why we should take time to do what is best, what is right, what is good in a situation, maybe in a volatile situation, so that we can promote the common good for each other. And within Catholic social teaching, for example, there's a hierarchy of values. There's the principle of subsidiarity, for example, the principle of the common good, for example. And we have to negotiate between these values in our social lives, in our spiritual acts, in order to bring about just society, in order to care for the younger ones and leave the right impression on them, to respond in such ways to the children that we will help shape them in virtue and not vice, and not repeat our bad histories. So finally, just to wrap up this preliminary definition of spirit, of spiritual being, Edith Stein says, illumination, again in a more intellectual epistemological sense, also in a moral sense, illumination and openness in the subjective spirit mean becoming conscious of itself, seiner selbst bewusst werden. Seiner selbst bewusst werden, becoming conscious of itself as spiritual being, and knowing, erkennen. And in the objective spirit, what it means is becoming transparent for thought as idea. Thank you for the compliment. Lectures have been very helpful. It's a pleasure. Thank you, LCFA, Living Christian Faith Assembly. It's a pleasure to be in dialogue here through the live stream. Thank you for your interest and for saying so. So, subjective spirit, becoming conscious of itself, what we experience as persons, self-awareness, self-consciousness, conscience, the voice within the self adjudicating between good and evil, all of these things are evidence of spirit. becoming over time even more and more self-conscious, self-aware, and other-aware. And what we mean by objective spirit, something like the form of a circle, something like the idea of hope or joy or justice or color, any abstract idea is real, but it is precisely not in itself made of atoms. We have spiritual objects we call ideas, we call meanings, we call synthesized and integrated sensations, and we give language to these spiritual objects like spiritual object. And every word, every intelligible utterance points to it is, and is every word itself is a spiritual object. Every word is a meaning, coordinated with other meanings. And meanings are not made of atoms. We don't just deal with atoms. We're not just conglomerations of atoms dealing with atoms. No way, is not true. We are spiritual and embodied beings, at once spirit and matter, that we're interacting with the world through perceiving it, interpreting it, and through volitional, meaningful activity in the world. And all the evidence of this volitional, meaningful activity in the world for human beings, we call culture. We call culture. Making tools, constructing buildings, not just uh, um, architecture, that we're able to abstract from the matter and turn and face it and deal with it and contemplate it and think about it and manipulate it and allow it to serve this common good is evidence of spirit. So theology today, philosophy today, has so much more work to do to give a greater account of spirit, of spiritual being. Edith Stein is helping us do this. So we have objective spirit and subjective spirit. Subjective spirit is the human soul, an angel, or divinity, by way of analogy. Objective spirit includes ideas, meanings, things like numbers, mathematics. This is why mathematics is so good to study. Geometry is so good to study because it puts us in touch with objective spirit, with spiritual objects, with rational meanings that we say make sense and equate and go somewhere and allow us better to understand the real. So we need liberal arts. We need all these fields of studies to continue to humanize our humanity and not let it be hijacked by the entropic ways of matter alone. We see this happening in the universities today, an amputation of the liberal arts, an amputation of the humanities, almost as if to say we would be better off if we were powerful robots. But no, we will never trade our humanity for technology. Technology is a means to an end. It's at our service. But technology is created by man for man. Man is not created for technology. Man is not created for the sake of matter. Matter is part of man, but not the most important, fundamental, essential part. Matter is part. It's inherent, it's intrinsic to man, but matter adheres to spirit, to form, to formal causality, to volition. We need to get straight the exact relationship between matter and spirit. And we have to ensure that our young people can continue to think about these things too, even if we have separation of church and state in a particular nation or society. We still need to find ways to talk about that which is not allowed to be talked about in certain public sectors. And this we do here, now. This we should do in conversations we have with people we know, maybe our own children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews or friends. And this is very important for the sake of truth, for the sake of our humanity. Edith Stein was a champion of thinking toward the whole, and she regards spirit to be the centerpiece of the whole. That is an important point of recognition, that spirit is the center, not the atom. The atom depends on something other than itself. We call spirit, we call form, we call cause, we call act, actuality. So both subjective spirit and objective spirit um, involve this becoming conscious of itself in the case of subjective spirit, and becoming transparent and becoming known in the case of objective spirit. The eidetic object, the idea, the meaning, erkannt werden, to become known. So we'll go on with our next live stream to think about more of this distinction between objective spirit and subjective spirit, working our way to a very exciting moment in the book where I propose a kind of hierarchical understanding of being in terms of concentric circles, which is the original meaning of hierarchy, not higher and lower, not so much pyramid structure, but concentric circles of being in relation. We're going to get to this point in the live streams coming up. But for now, I'm about to wrap it up unless there's any further questions, comments for us today in this live stream entitled Toward a Phenomenology and Metaphysics of Matter and Spirit. I hope you draw profit from these live streams. It's a pure joy for me to get to talk about these things with this much depth because it's something I could never do in a class, in a course. There's not enough time. But if I go on live stream Monday through Friday for about an hour to an hour and a half, I have all the time in the world to get into these topics. And I'm really thankful for your interest, for you being with me to share the joy of this discovery of truth, to share the joy of contemplating goodness, because it takes time. And yet, it's best to do this in community. But one of the advantages we have with our technology today is to do this extemporaneously, spontaneously, to do this impromptu rendezvous around truth. So I don't publish when I'm going on live stream. I just intend to as much as possible. And sometimes our paths will cross virtually. And that's a real advantage we have with the internet and things today, even connecting around the world. It's incredible. So why not do this? Why not see the advantage and just rejoice in the truth together, proclaim the good news together, uh, and and continue to ask these questions together in a very transparent way, in a kind of vulnerable way. But I thank you for your charitable attitudes toward the material, toward the content, toward me, and it's a great labor of love. So thank you very much. Again, if you have any questions, comments, you could put them in the chat now. I'll be happy to talk about them. Otherwise, we'll wrap up this live stream for today and look forward to those ahead. Working my way through commentary on the commentary, human and divine being. This is the basis of things I'm saying. But probably most of what I'm saying is not this text. It's in addition to this text. So I feel confident that it's better for me to provide this commentary through live stream rather than just go in solitude and write another book. I feel like in the world of publishing today, we have many forms of publication, both written and things like this, oral, video, podcasts, audio. And we need to take advantage of these things as scholars, as philosophers and theologians, for the sake of further investigation, the pursuit of truth, but also for sharing the good news about it all. I don't write a book that it would gather dust on the shelf. I write it to share it. And if this is a great way I can share it, I want to do so. So I thank God for the opportunity. Again, I thank you for your presence, for your interest, and I encourage you in your work, in your meaningful work. Something that Maria Montessori says is that every person, every individual person has his or her cosmic task. No one else can complete this mission except you. You have your own cosmic task. You've been ordained, you've been assigned, you've been sent on mission. It's for you to accomplish, you to fulfill. And it's so important that you believe that you can, like Paul Ricoeur says. You believe that you can, and by God's grace, you can all the more because God is the one who sends each of us on mission in this order of creation to burn out bright, like that Switchfoot song talks about. I want to burn out bright in this world. Through the spiritual illumination, Edith Stein is talking about the nature of spirit. Each one of us has our own special cosmic task, our own special meaningful work. And it's important, as my wife Megan reminds me all the time, it's important for each one of us to keep our eyes on our own work and not be saying, hey, what's this person doing over there, that person doing over there? We just recognize what is our cosmic task, our own special work to be done, and we do it. Hopefully, where we're living in the world, with freedom, with a lack of obstacles. But even when there are obstacles, there are challenges. This virtuous life that overcomes, that perseveres, and to say with Don Quixote, uh, I hear dogs barking, Sancho. This means we're moving forward. What a beautiful thought Don Quixote gives us, that when we experience trials, persecution, the dogs are barking. It's a sign we're on the right track. We're moving forward. We're testifying to spirit in a material world. And the matter will not overcome it because it's actually being redeemed by it as we speak. And this is the purpose of the sacrament in the church, that intersection, the perpetuation of the incarnation of God given to us in word and sacrament, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. That's another topic for another time. But I thank you for your time and joining me. May we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.